I'm Wish. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the founder of Into the Orbit Consulting. More importantly, and more relevant, I'm the host of this podcast, Rain Bullshit. Rain Bullshit is the podcast where we throw out the patented, power-polished corporate scripts and we talk about the beautiful, messy parts of us that bring our whole self into the workplace. Each episode, I sit down with a brilliant guest. These are amazing people. They're leaders, they're change makers, they're creatives. And we unpack their stories through 3 personal words. And they can be anything. No fluff, no posturing, just honest reflections, sharp insights, and a little bit of chaos. Rainbows and Bullshit was born out of a need for space. Space to unpack and honestly experience navigating systems that weren't built for people like us. It's about what it means to lead with integrity, to build inclusive spaces, and to do the deep, uncomfortable human work of change. If you're tired of surface level inclusion talk and you're ready for something a bit more real, honest, and human, you're in the right place. So grab a drink, take a breath, and let's get into it.
I love how we started this episode laughing. I'm so sorry. Simon's having to position himself quite strategically. This is where video is a great tool for those watching. You won't hear Simon if you're audio, but you'll see the faces that he's making. So thank you firstly for bearing with me. I won't bore my listeners with the palaver that we've had this morning in terms of getting set up. We are here. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you for being an amazing guest. Today I've got the joy of having to talk. That sounds very forced, doesn't it? Having a conversation.
I force my way in. You have to talk to me. Have to.
With the absolutely inspiring and incredible Simon Blake. So Simon, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Simon. I forced my way in and made you have a conversation with me, and I am the Chief Exec of Stonewall, the LGBT charity. I've been Chief Exec for about 8 months, and before that I was at the Social Enterprise Mental Health First Aid England, and before that National Union of Students, Brooke Advisory Centres, as well as sexual health charity for young people, and National Children's Bureau. So all of those things were jobs which I did instead of being an educational psychologist, which is what I was supposed to be. But I fell in love, went to America, all went wrong. I came back, got a job in a pub, then ran a sex education project for young men, and the rest is history. I'm suddenly looking at retirement in 10 years' time.
Wow. I did not know half of that. I could do a whole episode on that journey alone. I mean, I've got so many thoughts. So obviously you chose it. I love your trajectory. It's very random. But also, do you think it isn't random? Do you think there was, do you think that it brought you to kind of the point that you're at in terms of your career?
It was definitely accidental. But all of it felt right at each different part. And I actually wasn't expecting to be the Chief Exec of Stonewall, because I was, my partner has just changed career, slowed down from work, sort of again unexpectedly circumstances created that, and I was thinking, I'll do a non-exec role and I'll do some coaching, and I trained as a coach. And then when the advert for Stonewall came out and the headhunters contact, and I'm like, don't think so. And then suddenly I was like, actually yes, maybe. So I do think that there is something about listening to your gut, listening to your instinct, allowing yourself to have, I guess, an adventure, and
love that,
and doing what feels right. And if it feels right and it's not, then just change it.
Wow. Seriously, what an inspiring story. And I'm sure you have so much to offer in terms of insights, because a lot of what you just said, which is really interesting about being playful and just kind of seeing where it goes, kind of lends itself to kind of some of the things and the themes that you want to talk about this morning. So let's start with courage to lead. So when I asked you about kind of the 3 themes, one of them that you checked in was having the courage to lead, and I guess taking a really honest reflection of that kind of skill from a leadership perspective in today, in 2025. Tell me more about that.
So the reason that I thought about it was reflecting, and I have done quite a lot of reflecting over the last 5 or 6 years about how much has changed in terms of leading. So I've always worked in around issues that some people find difficult to talk about. And so when we were doing the repeal of Section 28 and the age of consent work from the National Children's Bureau 25 odd years ago, you would get an occasional message which would be people's opposition to what you were doing, but it would come in the form of a letter. And so you would be sat in a desk and you would read the letter where somebody, from at its most extreme, people not wanting you to be here, at its gentle, it was, you're a disgusting person.
Oh, wow.
But it was a letter. Whereas, and now you are in a situation where any decision, any choice that you make and it's communicated, people can find you in all sorts of platforms. And I think it leads to worse decisions. And I think we see that in politics. I think we see that in charities. I think we see that in the world in the way, because we're worried immediately about what people are going to do. And we also don't have control of the messaging. So, if I speak at an event, what can happen is that somebody can positively put out that I said something, somebody interprets that and then uses it, and before you know it, things spiral. So that sense of being centered in yourself, really being clear that you know that things when we work in tricky issues, or issues that some people don't agree with, that people will willfully misinterpret, or they will take something out of context, or they will oppose it. So you've got to know why you're doing it and believe it. And I think that is a different skill to the skills which we're teaching children and young people at school. We don't do much which is about helping people to understand risk, to take risk, to build confidence in their views, to know when they really believe something versus when they're going along with something. And we don't necessarily teach that in leadership programs either. We teach SWOT analysis and we teach PESTLE and all really useful tools. But actually that sense of courage to lead, courage to be yourself, feels to me as though it's probably something that people are going to need more and more in a world that is ever more polarised, where we hear the loudest views rather than the measured views, where lots of people that agree or are silent agreeers don't say anything. So it can feel as though things are more volatile than they perhaps are.
Such fascinating and such. I really resonate with so much of what you shared. We had a guest actually talk about polarization, and we started the season off really thinking about the kind of cancel culture that we're in. We see this happening. We see marginalized groups being kind of victimized and politicized, really. And the world is a scary place. Do you think? And so back to the kind of reflection of having, and I really like the way you framed it, which was I know about myself, or I've centered that self to be able to have that courageous kind of, or to lead with your principles. Do you think that's always been a trait that you've had, or do you think that's kind of evolved over the years?
I think it's always been a trait that I have. I grew up in an environment where there was a lot which was about you have to believe what you do. And it was I grew up in a Methodist home, and that very much was part of the sort of growing up story. But my, if I was to boil down what my mum and dad taught me and my brother, it was essentially, that work hard, play hard, be kind sort of bit, and would then evolve into sleep 8 hours a day, work 8 hours a day, pay 8 hours a day, those sorts of things. But it was also very much about that very much a treat people as you want to be treated, believe the things that you believe, and stand up for what you believe in. I do think it obviously gets easier as you get older,
right?
Or I found it gets easier as you get older. I definitely, as a gay man, grew up with the homophobia of the 80s and the 90s, and that does leave a lasting legacy in my body, I guess. But as I've got older, and there was a moment on my 50th birthday where I was, we were just in a pub. We had a mezzanine floor, and just looked around and saw all these amazing people who I'd met in my life, and I thought, I've spent some of my life feeling afraid of what might happen. I've got to 50, and the things I was afraid of happening hadn't happened. The things that I hadn't spent any time worrying about had happened. And and there's a magical picture where it's a court where I'm just doing a dance bit, and it's a moment where I'm like, sod it, the next 10 years of your working life, the rest of your life, you're going to just do what you need to do, and that feels important.
It's actually made me teary. I think that's because it really resonates with me at the moment, starting a new scary business and thinking, and I worry, so I'm an anxious, I've got a lot of anxiety in just general, I'm an anxious person. And to hear your journey and to hear what you said, which will stick with me, which is it gets easier, is really comforting in where I am on a very, my point in life where, I'm kind of figuring a lot of stuff out and I'm having to do all of that figuring out in a world that is incredibly volatile, and so it's great to hear your 50th. It's great to hear the reflection of the people around that table and that kind of almost freeing piece and that kind of piece to kind of just that you're like, okay, it is what it is. Do you think that generally we as leaders are not being as courageous as we should or could be?
I mean, there's a lot of courage in the world, isn't there? And so I wouldn't want to generalise and say that we're not, but it feels to me as if it is harder to be. No, it's not harder. That's not true. It is a different environment in which to be courageous, and you have much more scope for people to be able to challenge you, attack you, to undermine you if they want to. And that inevitably, when you are thinking, about things, will impact then on your ability, because we like to, as much as we might want to change the world, we also want to have joy and to have peace and to do things. So I do think that it's a different context. I just think it's different. That it's like lots of things, isn't it? It's that somebody will send you an email and then they send you a text, tell you they sent you an email, and then they check 5 minutes later you've received it. It's like all these communication platforms that people are wanting of you, and to your point about not worrying and being anxious, I'm really lucky in that I've never had that experience where it's impacted in that sort of way. But it is about how do you use your energy, and courage takes energy. And if other people are taking your energy, which I do think this world is a lot of other people taking your energy,
that's really powerful.
Then you've got to work hard to make sure that you can be courageous.
That's such a brilliant reference. We talk about courage a lot. I think it's one of the words that I think, especially for my clients, conflict is high, views are high. You'll experience that given where you are now, but also in the charity sector, we have an activist workforce, and so we're working at a time where there's really strong views and beliefs, and you're having to kind of be courageous. But I've really like how you frame the energy piece, because actually, as you rightly say, for me, I naturally am conflict averse. People will listen to this and laugh because there'll be situations where perhaps that doesn't come through after I've had a few drinks maybe, but I do feel that I can have that conversation. It's absolutely, as you say, it's about actually creating the right energy. It's going, right, if I'm going to do that today, that's going to take up a chunk of my reserve or energy, so that is that's my big focus. And I think not many enough people talk about that side of courage in terms of not just able to do it, but what it takes out of you when you do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it takes out and it gives in. That's the joy of it, isn't it? But actually it does both of those things. But I do think that we do need to think about how do you protect your peace, how do you create the energy, how do you refill, how do you make sure that you're doing the things which are fun, how do you also, it's interesting you use the word conflict, because what I will always say to people is, conflict is deep. Conflict is really, really strong, and having different opinions is not conflict. And yet somehow we learn that managing conflict, having courageous conversations. Whereas actually, if we've sat around a table as an exec team, in all organisations, and we've all agreed, I would be worried, because that probably means that we haven't interrogated stuff well enough, or we haven't heard, or if I'm the most senior person, I've appointed people who are going to agree with me, rather than people who are going to tend. But I think it's also, again, it's that the world, isn't it? So it's shifted and changed, and it's not harder, it's just different. But that sense about what's going on in the world, whether it's geopolitics, whether it's what's happening locally, whether it's what's happening in America, whether it's all of the issues which you care about, but we can't work in the context of everything that we're doing. If we, our charitable objects, if you're in the context of charity, means that you do have to stay true to what you're doing, and yet there are so many other factors. And how we therefore navigate our way through that. And I do think there's a lasting effect of COVID, and how we were so isolated, or physically isolated from people, and the way that we then connected and engaged with work and with each other and with relationships, which we don't necessarily have to go back to how we were, but we have to be conscious that things did shift, that they did change, and that needs to be a conscious part of how we work in the future.
Absolutely. Do you think the world's that's a very binary question, but do you think the world's better? I mean, we had 2020, obviously we had COVID. Do you think we're moving in the right direction? Very big question.
I mean, are we moving in the right direction? It's in some areas, yes. In some areas, absolutely not. The significant inequality, whether you think about that globally, whether you think about that on a micro level or on a macro level, just says no, we haven't got it right. And those inequalities might be economic inequalities, they might be racial disparities, they might be on the basis of sexuality or gender identity. But there are so many inequalities in the world that we have to. That in my mind have to be addressed, and they will only be exacerbated by really big issues like climate change and so I get you. I hear you. Yes and no. That's a question for
I think that's yes and no, as you rightly say, is exactly kind of I think where a lot of us land. Like, in some ways and in some others. So tell me a bit more. So earlier on you spoke about joy, and you talked about having to balance that joy and that hope and that peace. I think you said the word peace with obviously the conflict and the courage. Tell me more about pride and joy at work. I know you're keen to kind of to talk about that. I mean, obviously, I know you spearheaded MHFA during a really really pivotal moment, I think, for a lot of us when it comes to mental health. And what's your view on bringing that kind of hope and pride and joy into kind of work?
I think the reason that I wanted to focus on it is because work is a really significant part of our lives. Whether we want it to be or whether we don't want it to be. Most people have to work, and it takes up a huge amount of the time. And it worries me that the conversation and the discourse about work is often about workplace stress.
Okay.
And it worries me because I think if you talk about things being stressful, they start off being stressful, and then when you add actual stress into it, then it becomes worse, and that isn't a good place for us to be. When actually, work gives us relationships. It gives us an opportunity to stretch ourselves. It gives us the opportunity to learn about a topic, to grow, to develop skills. It gives us, so many opportunities. And that's not just what happens in work, but the relationships that you build. The 20s, I came here in 1998 into London on a secondment for a year. And I met amazing people. I'm still here 25 years later because of that. Wow. And yes, you can say, work, and there's been the highs and there've been the less brilliant bits and all of those sorts of things. But what's been consistent through all of it is it's given a stable base, a steady platform, a place to make friends, a place to learn, a place to grow, and to try to make a contribution to the world. And so it worries me that work is a problem. It also, I don't want to sound like a dinosaur and say everybody back to the office, but it also worries me that work becomes solitary and work is isolated because, we need connection, we need relationships. We may not need an office, but we do need to make sure that we know how we're going to form those relationships. And of course, people will have the importance of relationships will be different to different people, but they are important, and they're So there's something for me about, given that work has such an important place in our time and our energy, how do we make sure that it has an important place in our heart as well? And so often we don't talk about what work gives us. We talk about what work takes from us, and the issues that it causes, and I think it's really important that we think about it as also being somewhere that we can create change, that we've got choices.
Yeah, I love that. Really, yeah. Do you think there's an intergenerational viewpoint that differs when it comes to work?
There are definitely generational viewpoints. I did a panel which was actually about intergenerational attitudes at work, but it was very specific around LGBT people, and I was the elder on the panel.
I like that framing there, the elder. Have you got loads?
Yeah, exactly. And there were four generations of us, and it was, what did we expect from work? And I obviously started, and when I came out to my mum and dad, they were really worried. They were worried that I was going to be hurt, bullied, or if I would get a job, all those sorts of things. So I went into interviews going, just want to get a job. Just want to get a job. I don't want anything else other than a job. And then you sort of heard slightly different versions. And the person who was the younger, I don't know how the youngest person on the panel, that I wanted to know that I was going to be seen, that I was going to be heard, that I could take myself into the workplace. And it was a really interesting and inspiring conversation. But it also made me think, actually, I still want work. I want to be able to be myself. I want to be able to be authentic about myself, but I want work to have a place, and for me to be myself in work and out of work, and not to over expect from work.
I like that.
So work for me is very much a job, a passion, but it isn't life. And I don't know whether that's an unfair representation. But I also know that I've been lucky in that work gave me enough money to be able to buy a flat in London. It wouldn't be possible now on the salary. I was only 24,500. I got a promotion to 27,000, and I managed to get a flat in London for less than 80,000 in the 90s, and that isn't possible. So if work isn't giving you some of those things that we value, or society and traditionally value, then perhaps it needs to give a bit more in return, or perhaps you give a bit less to it in return.
Adjust it.
And also, we didn't have LinkedIn and Twitter and other ways to get yourself known. So the only way to get your views out into the world was to be published by your organisation in the work that I've done. And so therefore that also made me work hard. So, perhaps those sort of the economic reward, the ability to make the difference that you want in the world, I got those from work. If I didn't get those from work, would I be talking about the joy of work? I don't know.
And that's fascinating, and I'm sure many listeners are probably going to be writhing with envy at your first flat and how much you in comparison to where we are now.
Unfortunately, I sold it before it went through the roof and Peckham became famous.
I live near Peckham. I'm in Sydenham, so I know the area really well.
There were no street lights, and I was told you shouldn't move there when I brought it, but I did, and I loved it. It was great.
I think the next, your final theme and reflection, I think you've done such justice to what we're about to kind of share now, and the, kind of your final thoughts and reflections and your check-in in terms of being your authentic self. But we're ending on the theme of being your authentic self. I have a lot of views, you know this, I have a lot of views on the term. I struggle with that term because I think that sometimes it's weaponized and it's commercialized as a performative inclusion gesture, and many of us aren't or don't feel safe. I know definitely from an LGBT perspective, but from a race perspective and other kind of marginalized groups as well. So I struggle with the term. But tell me about the term and what it means to you, and what you hope to share in terms of that term.
So, just to be really explicit about the term, you're talking about taking your whole self to work.
Okay, yeah.
Is that what you're saying? Rather authentic self, yeah. So,
okay, sorry, whole self.
Okay.
And authentic. Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm talking about whole self.
Okay.
But I know you want to talk about authentic.
Yeah. So the reason, I just thought it's just useful to clarify. So the reason, when I was at MHF England, we developed the term, the campaign around the whole self, and not with the view that everybody had to take themselves, but that people shouldn't have to hide parts of who they are if they can. Now, clearly, there are some people who can hide parts of who they are, and then some things that you cannot hide, which I think it goes absolutely to your point. And And particularly, some of the feedback we got in the early days was from Black people, people of colour, from Global Majority, who would say, this is a privilege which some of us, don't have to. But I still think the principle of being able to be who you are in the context of work is a really important one, and that workplaces and cultures should shift, and that we need to address that, whether that's about race, whether it's about gender, whether it's about disability, etc. However, I recognise where we are, where we need to be, and that there's a big gap. And what we'd never want people to do is to feel as though they were being asked to do something which was not able to be. And so that sense about psychological safety is incredibly, incredibly important. I guess where I've got to in the last sort of bit, so I am not good at planning. So you asked me to write something. So in terms of a sort of personality, yellow, I can do the yellow.
Uh-huh.
You asked me to make it happen, I can get you to red.
Okay.
Ask me to write the plan that gets you from yellow to red, and I will sit there for days. Now, I used to feel embarrassed about that, and particularly, the more senior you got, what do you mean you can't write a plan? I can write a plan for myself, but I can't necessarily write one that's going to make sense for you.
It's so refreshing to hear this.
And so there's something about now I will sit and we've been doing some work, and I just said both to some members of the board, but also to my team, that I'm not going to be able to do this. So somebody else help, because otherwise, perhaps I should be able to, but it's not going to play to my strength, and I'll do something, and then you'll say, oh, it doesn't quite work here, and how does that KPI match that? And I'll just sit there and be, I should have been able to do better, and that doesn't make sense. So for me, there's something about being able to own the fact that you can't do something very well, and that doesn't mean that you are better or worse than somebody. It just means that you need somebody else to do that particular bit. And I guess that sense of we don't have to be perfect whole. We can be, we are perfect whole. We don't have to be perfect across the stream in order to be able to be whole.
Uh-huh.
I think is where I've got to. And again, that sort of moment of being 50, and also it's not. I don't think it's even about being 50. So my brother died unexpectedly 10 years ago, so didn't make it to 50, and that's a sort of a moment. And then I was really lucky in that during COVID, Mum wasn't lucky. Mum got terminally ill, but it was COVID when Mum got terminally ill, so I was able to be there for the last 3 months of her life, and so I was able to get her life lessons. And she's like, some of it took me to 70 to work out, and I just wish I could have fast-tracked to 30, which interestingly was what my granddad said to me when he was dying. He's like, just get your mum to relax and stop worrying about what other people think about you. So he was 74 when he was saying it about Mum. Mum was 75 when she was saying it about herself and trying to transmit it to me. And then the last few years, my dad, before my dad died, it was just me and my dad, and we spent a lot of time talking. And all that I just realised through it is that nagging doubt of who you are, not because anybody else is thinking about it, but because we don't feel good enough from within, and that just feels like a horrible place to live. So I think I'm sort of just getting to that point of how do we enable people to reach that earlier? Because it doesn't make sense to be in the years of our life where we've got discovery and adventure and opportunity and all of those things, but to be feeling a little bit inadequate. And then when you get to the point where you might be looking back on your life, you go, if only I'd known now that it was okay. And obviously, life is an adventure, and you have to develop some of that. But something about the wisdom of older age and how we pass that through and think about it in the context of work. When I was at Brooke, the Young People's Social Health Charity, set up in 1967, we had some 3 generations of people who'd been involved in Brooke. And at one point there was a conversation which is a bit like you had now, are we making progress? So there's a conversation about it's harder for young people now because of online porn and sexual stereotypes, to which the person who set out said, harder than when we had to have a backstreet abortion and when we couldn't get contraception. It may be different, but it's neither harder or worse. And I think that those moments where you hear people talk about that are perhaps ones which we don't cherish enough or we don't use enough in the context of work and outside.
Wow. Oh, God. that give me goosebumps. I think hearing you take the lessons quite in it, I could see how you were taking the lessons that your parents had passed to you, and I reflect a lot on my parents. I'm son of immigrants, and there's a whole story that I don't necessarily know about, and I think to hear kind of your grandfather and then what your mother was kind of sharing with you, and then I know you recently lost your father, and my deepest condolences, but how you've made sense of that is inspiring. So
let's see if it's inside. So, but I think talking about it does make sense of it.
I really do think absolutely, and I say one of our big slogans is "Conversations save lives." I think that's such an important message to share. And to your point at the end, comparison. We talk about different generations and different ways, what the world was, but comparison is a thief of joy for me. So I think, as you rightly say, that was a really astute reflection, and I think you've really managed to sway me in terms of what wholeness. And I remember the campaign with MHFA, and I remember the word whole, and now the way you've kind of, I guess, articulated that in terms of the parts of ourselves that can really kind of contribute to meaningful discussion and dialogue. I mean, that's really, really powerful. So I'm going to end it on this note. I think, I could talk to you for, I would literally, you're welcome on the show anytime.
No, thank you.
It's been an absolute honour and a privilege to have you on the show, Simon. Thank you very much. And thanks to all my listeners. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for having me.